Right, well, we're going to start on the substantive content of the day, and I'm very pleased to tell you that we have a national treasure to present to you. Dr. Angela Jackson, brain the size of a planet, and she's going to lend it to us for about 20 minutes this morning. She's the lead economist for impact economics and policy, a health economist who's worked at the highest levels of government, including at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. She's worked across tax, fiscal and social policy. She was the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Australian Finance Minister, thus responsible for providing policy advice across fiscal policy and all areas of social policy, national health reform. She has great capacity and is a great communicator, and that's why she's here today. She's authored a number of high-profile reports on health, aged care, disability, housing, gender policy. I'm not going to go through her entire list of accomplishments because it would nibble in to our time advantage, which we are still enjoying, people. It means potentially another biscuit at morning tea. So we're going to hold on to it. Just give me, I'll give you the assurance. This woman's brilliant, and she's going to speak to us right now. Angela Jackson.
Good morning, and look, thank you everyone for having me here this morning. It's a great honour to be presenting in Parliament House and to you today at such a formative time in your history as coming together to try and address some of the really big challenges facing your sectors collectively and individually. And I'm hoping the next couple of days for you are incredibly important, I think, in terms of forming those connections, but also finding some of those solutions. I'd like to also start by acknowledging country. We are on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and they are the enduring custodians of this land. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal leaders here today who are joining us, hopefully online and also here in person. It is a very difficult time in our history, and I want to acknowledge that. The events of this year have been particularly difficult for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the leaders across the community. And I want to provide my thanks to that leadership in terms of the generosity of spirit of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders this year in really trying to take Australia on a journey of reconciliation. And I just want to once again recommit to the Uluru Statement of the Heart and continuing to walk with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on that path towards reconciliation. Now, you guys pretty much are it, right? Like, flavour of the month. You're here, you're in Parliament House. This is a very, very special place, and the fact that you are here really goes to, I think, the importance that is being placed on your sectors right now in our country. Getting this sector right, as Alicia Payne, who I used to work with, and I'm struggling in terms of probably the proper title there, Alicia, apologies, the member, obviously for Canberra, getting this sector right is really, really critical for our economic future, to the operation of our society, and in many cases, obviously, to our own individual well-being. In today's opening address, what I'm going to aim to do is to provide you some context to the challenges that you are facing, your sectors. I will present some ideas for how they might be solved, but really this is about you coming together, learning from each other about what is going to work to really drive the jobs and skills of the future in these sectors that are so critical to our economy. Now, I do have to apologise before I start. I am a health economist who does a lot of work in the hospital and care space. So a lot of the data I present and the analysis is focused on those sectors, but I am not ignoring the sport and recreation professionals within the group today. And in fact, I know personally the importance of that sector in terms of driving health and well-being. And so a lot of the lessons, and I will draw those lines through, that I can draw from that broader work do also apply to that sector. Now, mentions are very important in this modern age. We all know that obviously social media mentions in particular are pretty important. But right now, there isn't much in terms of the mentions and the importance of them. Those in Parliament are a pretty critical one, right? How much your sector gets mentioned in the House, I don't know where it is it that way? That way, is a pretty important metric about where you stand. Now, if we look at how many mentions there were in the previous government versus the new mentions in the new government, we can see a discernible change in terms of focus. We can see that also through the strategic plans of the new government in terms of the importance that the care economy has in this government's plans for the future. It is now recognised, I think, very much as an engine room of economic growth. There's a growing understanding in particular that not all service jobs are created equal, and that the jobs of the workforce that you represent, in the capacity that they have to free up others to work, the capacity they have to lift the productive capacity of all workers across the economy, makes you absolutely critical to our economic prosperity. There are obviously other reasons why politicians like talking about the care economy, and one of those is spending. You do also represent a significant part, particularly of Commonwealth spending. Spending on things like the NDIS, aged care, health, hospitals, represents around 20% of Commonwealth government spending. When you add to that payments to individuals, you're up over 50%. It's big bucks, and it's a big issue. The big issue, obviously, for government is the growth in this spending. And so this is the annual growth out to 2063 that was in the IGR. And you can see those annual rates of growth, and you don't have to be a finance expert to recognise that that compounding growth means an increasing proportion of the budget is going to go towards your sectors. And so it's important for the government to see that there's value in that spending. And that comes down to a workforce that is productive, that is highly skilled. The other reason is jobs. Your sector is an absolute and utter jobs bonanza at the moment. 1 in 3 jobs since the beginning of the pandemic has been in your sector, in your sectors collectively. Now, given that your sectors only represent around 1 in 7 jobs before the pandemic started, that disproportionate growth is simply massive. And it is providing many Australians with their first opportunities for secure work and ongoing work for a very long time. That growth is, supporting households through a cost of living crisis. It is very, very, very important for the broader economy. However, despite that growth, which seems huge, it seems good news, have you had too much success? Because even with that growth, we are seeing these critical skill shortages across all the sectors, across aged care, across childcare. And these vacancies across the economy have just grown exponentially. Now, we can see that even in the lead up to the pandemic, the growth in the vacancy rates and those shortages were expanding in the care sector and in the care industries compared to the rest of the economy. But since that pandemic hit, it has been a phenomenal level of growth. And you know these critical skill shortages. You will be hearing it from your employers about what it means. And what it means is children getting sent home from childcare because they can't stay open. What it means is aged care facilities having to close and families having to find emergency accommodation, people having to stop working to care for their elders in their families. It means elective surgeries being cancelled, people not being able to get back to work because of injury, because they can't have things treated. The impact and the broader impacts on the economy are huge. This is really why we're here today, right, is solving this problem. But in bad news, this problem is going to get worse. So even when we see the pandemic impacts, and they will dissipate over time, we know that from history, and we will see some of those skill shortages alleviate. Even when that occurs, when we look to the long term, when we look about the skills that are going to be in demand across our economy into the future, we can see, unfortunately, or in good news, that there are going to be the skills that are needed to perform the jobs in the care industry are going to be in demand, not just in the care sector, but more broadly. And that is going to make it much harder to attract and retain staff. And that really is, I think, the critical issue for the sector going forward. It is one thing to get the training right, but how do you retain those staff? How do you provide those pathways and those professional pathways so people make a career in these industries? So what all this means, I guess, is really that the problems are going to get worse. And sorry, this is me going down into the depths. I'll come back up. I've been told you start high, you go low, and then you come back with a solution. So this is the low point, I promise. These are going to be very, very big shortages. So we're talking around 285,000 by 2050, and there is no silver bullet to the problem. It's going to be a collective effort of trial, of error, and then doubling down on what works over time. There are going to have to be a lot more forums like this. It's not a one-hit shop. It is going to be work, work, and then work some more. Now, one thing I think we do here, and I do want to address, and I note Chris Richardson was on Q&A around this issue last night, is that migration is the answer, that all we need to do is have more migrants and that will solve the problem across all these sectors. Migration is always going to be part of the solution and a very important one for the Australian economy and our society. It keeps us dynamic, it keeps us who we are as a country, but it's not going to do all the heavy lifting in terms of addressing the skills shortages. There is a lot more to this story. And to show that, I'm going to show you two slides. Now, this one seems to go against exactly what I've said, but that's always good to then bring home your point because you'll remember my point. Now, this chart shows the number of recent migrants in Australia who are working, those who have arrived since 2010, and what industries they're working in 2019. And yes, health and social care has a big proportion, 200,000 recent migrants across the sector working in the industry since 2019. So problem solved. And it looks like this is how you're going to solve your problem, but when you look at the percentage of the overall workforce, then you get a different picture. So even though there's 200,000 recent migrants in the industry in 2019, only 13%, that only represented 13% of the workforce, which is pretty much close to the national average and in fact not the leader. So that still leads you, and again this is always difficult maths, 87% of the workforce that is going to be Australian born and need to be trained. Of course, on top of that, many migrants working in the sector also need to be trained in Australia, so it doesn't necessarily diminish the task ahead. So what is the answer then, if it's not just more migration? Well, I think someone famously say it's the economy stupid. And it is a matter really of demand and supply. That's the paradigm that I work in every single day. How do we address that? How do we get that balance? So we are going to have more demand for workers, and so what should be the response to that? Well, the normal response for more demand than you have of supply is that, of course, price should go up, so wages should go up. But why isn't that happening in this workplace, and is that indeed enough? And how can we get to a space where we can properly value this work and people can see that it is worth their while to provide their labour to this industry on an ongoing basis? Now, wages are an issue. We had it raised previously that the issue around the level of skills and how perhaps the sector is perceived. It is perceived often as a low-skilled industry. It is not a low-skilled industry. Pretty much everybody working in this sector will have some form of qualifications, many high-level qualifications. But regardless of that, we can see that across the economy and compared to the broader economy, they're still paid less than comparatively skilled other workers. That creates a problem. If you are competing for the same level of qualifications from people in the sector and you're paying well under market rates, you're going to find it hard to attract people and then keep people in your sector. The answer to this is often this question of productivity, something economists talk a lot about. And in fact, at the moment, as we see these low levels of productivity across the economy, one of the big reasons for that is actually the growth in the care sector, because the value of an hour of work conducted in the care sector is not valued in our traditional measures of GDP as much as other forms of production, for example, mining. Now, how can it be, therefore, if you're, so undervalued or you're not producing value that you're in such great demand? Doesn't really make sense, does it? Well, it's got a lot to do, of course, with the nature of care work, and we have to acknowledge that. It is labour intensive, so there is a limit to the amount that can be produced in any hour. But there is another very important reason, and that is because GDP, which these measures all go off, is a very narrow measure of value. That the market, all it can measure is what the market itself can value. And where it's unable to value goods and services accurately, there can be market failure. So this may seem like a crazy, unorthodox concept, and I'm glad I'm not in a room full of economists because I might get things hurled at me. But there is greater value, there is more to economic value than what GDP measures. And in fact, we can think about this more broadly in terms of the types of things that individuals and the economy does value. So there is economic value, for example, in the childcare worker who influences the long-term health, educational and economic outcomes for children. There is economic value in the fitness worker, the Pilates instructor, that improves life satisfaction, increases economic participation and improves health outcomes of the people they work with. There is economic value in the aged care worker that improves the life satisfaction of the person they're caring for at the end of life. They lower levels of loneliness and through improving health outcomes, extend life and lower healthcare use. That all has economic value that isn't picked up in our traditional measures of gross domestic product. So you can see the problem we have here is that the value that's being generated by the workers in the industry are not being picked up in our traditional measures, and yet we are still demanding these services because they provide value to us and utility to us. And so it's this disconnect, I think, between the real value that the industry is creating, but how we necessarily measure that is creating this huge shortage of workers across the sector. So why don't we value the work? This is the perennial question, and Alicia has gone to it, I think, in her speech around the gendered aspect of it, and that's definitely part of it. There is also just market failure. It's difficult to capture some of these benefits. Markets work well when I, as an individual, can capture all the benefits of my consumption. Now, when other people also benefit from me consuming a good, it doesn't work so well. And in the care sector, there are those broader benefits than just the individual who is receiving the care or the fitness or other things. There are those broader impacts from both increasing productivity, from being allowed to work, and capturing those in value is very, very difficult. And that creates market failure, and it means that sometimes we don't price things accurately and therefore we get an undersupply of them, as we have seen in the care sector. The other area, of course, where there is an issue is the government, and sorry for the government representatives in the room. These are markets where prices are very much set by the government as the main buyer of services in the whole. And that does also create issues for the sector in terms of the way it can then price wages. You can't necessarily, if you can't increase the price of your good to match the demand for it, then you can't increase the wages. And so there is an important role for government in fixing some of these problems. And finally, of course, there is that gendered element. These are workforces that are heavily dominated by women. And it plays a big role in that undervaluation of the work. First of all, of course, and linked again to GDP, around half the work that's done in the economy that's largely done by women is that unpaid work. And that's not even measured or factored into any of these figures at all. And that undervaluation then flows through to the care sector, which is seen as, in some ways, the alternative to that unpaid work. So I've gotten you all the problems, why we're here. So what can we do about it? And that's really your job over the next few days, so good luck with that. But I'll try and help. I'll try and help along the way. There is much to do. There is much that we can do to make these critical sectors attractive places for people to build careers and to work. The first I've explored already, and it really goes to operationalising that broader valuation of the work undertaken across the sector. We already have at the national level a wellbeing budget framework that is really critical in this, and I think it is underplayed in many respects as sort of being, I don't know, the yoga beads or the whatever framework. But this is about measuring what really matters to lifting people's utility and their productivity, and because of that, it is critically important. And for your sector in particular, a sector that is all about that, it is an incredibly important vehicle. So broadening and better understanding the value that is created by the work done in the sector is really, really important. And that means moving beyond those traditional measures to really measure the true economic value of the work being undertaken. My second is the hot tip off the first. Higher wages, it's not escapable in my view. And we can sort of go around the edges and say, well, you know, it's not possible. But you're not going to attract people unless you pay them. That's Economics 101. And so we do need to see a lifting of wages in the sector so they match the level of skills from others, and so you can compete for those workers and keep them in the sector. The final one relates to a sort of, I guess, a flip on the why do we have an issue, and one of the reasons we have an issue is because of the gendered nature of the work and the sector. The reality is until we have more men working in the sector, unfortunately, we're unlikely to see higher wages. That's what the evidence says. More men will lift wages. It's quite a depressing statistic, but true. But the scale of the needs for the sector mean that we can't expect women alone to fill the gaps. We are going to have to broaden the scope of of people working in the sector, and that does mean having more men enter the workforce. There are a lot of innovative approaches overseas that could be applied, but a lot of it does come down to image around gender norms and addressing some of those fundamental gender inequalities. And so that work for this sector in particular is going to be really, really important moving forward. And I hope to hear, you know, some innovative ways in which that can be done coming out of the next couple of days. Look, thank you so much for listening to me this morning and for having me along to suggest a few ideas and hopefully providing some of that context with which you can then go forward and really come up with your ideas and improve your understanding. Sorry, someone put their hand up at the back and I wasn't sure if you wanted a question. No. Thank you very much for having me and good luck over the next couple of days. Thank you.